Welcome to the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar, Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University, and I'm joined by Professor Richard Wolff. Welcome to another episode of the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its politics, its economics, and its philosophy. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University. Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 p.m., you spend your time in the US or anywhere else in the world at a place known as the enterprise, the office, the farm, the firm. Yet, our economics profession pays surprisingly little attention to what Marx called the hidden abode of production. With me is Professor Rick Wolff, who spent his lifetime thinking about what happens Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 p.m. inside the firm, such that it literally, as we will see in today's episode, impacts everything else about the economic system. Hi, Rick. How are you today?
Okay, Shahram, glad to be here and glad to be talking about this.
Rick, I wanted to dive into the section 2 of your book, Knowledge in Class, for just to remind our audiences. We've covered section 1 of this book at length, which deals with the question of epistemology or theory of knowledge. And we discovered this unique new way of thinking about dialectics that was first proposed by Althusser in 1962 and then developed by Professor Wolff, Professor Resnick, and the community of ASA and Rethinking Marxism. So now we're going to look at part 2 of this particular book that deals with what is called ontology or theory of society, i.e., how we can use this lovely theory to make sense of the world. So I'm going to start with the question of the enterprise. And I want to start with the basics because I'm not going to assume an audience that knows this stuff. This thing called the class process. Could you help us understand what you and Steve mean by this term, class process?
Sure. The best way to do this is to start as simply as possible and then develop the complexities as we go along. Because at base, it is a simple story, and I don't want that simple core to get lost as we go into the weeds, as people like to say. Okay, in every human society of human beings, whether it be a handful of people living and traveling together, or a settled community, or a town, or a village, or a country, what we know by looking at it is that a part of the time, not all the time, but a part of the time, people need to work. They need to use their brains and their muscles, their bodies, their minds, to produce, to change nature in one way or another. They need to do that to feed themselves, without which they can't continue, to clothe themselves, to keep warm in the winter, and all the rest, to build a shelter so that they can function. And they do that. They work. We watch them. They keep animals. They grow plants. They pull things out of the forest, whatever it might be. And it varies with the conditions that human beings find in the world where they live. But one of the things we notice if we're very observant, and we have now the hindsight I do in telling it to you from all the people who have done the work ahead of me to help me see these things, they have taught me to notice that whenever people work, there is something peculiar about how they work, beyond the details of whether they gather nuts and berries in the forest, or they raise corn in the field, or they keep animals for milk, or whatever it might be. What we've noticed is they always produce more food, clothing, shelter, more than they themselves consume. Now, that's kind of remarkable. Maybe they didn't always. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they don't always produce more. But if so, those kinds of people don't seem to be around anymore. And I can figure out why. Because one of the things you need to produce more for is for your babies. You see, if you want your community to survive, or whether or not you want it, if your community is going to survive, you have to face the fact that you are going to die. You're not going to be there forever. So if I can see a community survive over time, then I know it must have produced babies, and I know how they do that. But after you've produced the baby and the baby emerges, then there are several years for the life of that baby during which it must consume food, it must consume clothing, it must consume shelter, it must fill in the blank, but it doesn't produce anything. Aha! Human communities, therefore, are characterized by the production of a surplus. All that it means is that human communities produce more than those involved in production themselves consume. And what that does is enable people who do not produce to survive because they can consume the surplus produced by those who do work. And whereas at first I think about babies, it doesn't take a long time of observation or just of thinking to imagine there could be a whole lot of people who are in that position. They don't have to work because they can live from a distribution of the surplus from those who do work. So, for example, you could have what we would later call religious people, clerics, those who intercede. If they believe in God, they talk to God or to gods. They intervene for the benefit of the community. We don't want them to raise animals or grow corn. We want them to talk to God because we believe that by doing so, we will get the rain, which will make our crops grow. So this becomes this is as important as feeding the baby. Do we have to feed the baby? No. The baby can die. There have been many communities at many times where this has happened by intention, by inadvertence, and everything in between. And the same is true about a cleric. All right? Now we can get the next step. We could organize production, aware of what I've just said, in such a way as to, here we go now, privilege a certain subsection of the population. We could say, you too, like a baby, like a priest, like a minister, like an imam, whatever it might be, you are important for this community in such a way that we will exempt you from labor. You don't have to work the way we do. You don't have to have animals, don't have to raise the crops. Here's what we want you to do. We want you to govern us. We are busy doing our work, but we need to take care of each other in complicated ways. We're growing. There's more and more of us. We're having enough babies that it's getting larger. Or here's another one. We are afraid of those people on the other side of the mountain. They threaten us, we think. So we not need 20 of you to specialize in getting up on a horse and having a long stick, and your job is to protect us from those people over there who might so we don't want you to work on the fields. We want you all day to practice how you get the stick into the nose of the other people, etc., etc. So we begin to have a privileged group of people, and we say we will sustain you. And these people begin to occupy a different role. They may do work, by the way. They may use their brains and muscles. For example, you need your brains and muscles to train the horse to behave properly in the event of a threat. You need to sharpen your stick. You need to get a bigger stick. You need to get people to keep your stick sharp. You need people to do work, but it's a different kind of work. It's a work designed to maintain the totality, not to produce the basic goods and services that the totality needs. And it's not always easy to see where one stops and the other one starts. But you understand that you can make a difference this way. One group of people produce the basic goods and services of the society. The other group of people work, use their brains and their muscles, but their work is designed to maintain a particular social arrangement of the society, not to produce the arrangement. The people on the horse with the stick, they don't produce anything, but they're there so that those who do produce are safe and secure. So you need them, because if the bad ones come over the hill, you won't have milk and you won't have corn and you won't have clothing. So one group of workers is understood to enable, they create the conditions that enable the productive workers to produce the surplus. By the way, that's all those words mean. Productive and unproductive in Marxian theory is about whether you produce a surplus or you live off of a distribution of the surplus.
It's not a
That's very
pejorative term.
what?
It's not a derogatory term, basically.
No, it doesn't rank you. A society to survive needs both of these kinds of work. If you don't have those guys on a horse, you're not going to survive. If you don't have the ones growing the corn, you're not going to survive. You need them to grow the corn, them to provide the protection or the intercedence with God or the governance of your community or whatever else you want to think about. Maybe people will produce much more, if there is music while they work. So they have a group of people and they say to them, you don't have to plow the soil. You don't have to keep the animals. We want you to take these instruments and make music with your fingers on these instruments, because we will all be happier. We will all perhaps be more productive in our work if you can talk to us, tell us stories, a storyteller, play music, a music person, etc., etc. These are people who live off the surplus. They don't have to produce. So the people who produce feed themselves, clothe themselves, but they also produce an extra, which is available, the surplus, to do what? Well, to do whatever decisions get made as to how to utilize a surplus that's available. And very quickly, societies learned that the larger the surplus, the more elaborate we can have enablers. So we don't have to live in a house, with barely enough room to stand up. We can have a tall house. It'll take more surplus to feed and clothe the workers who have to do more work to build a chateau. But if we have enough surplus, we can. And if you visit France or Germany or Italy, and you visit the chateau in France, or the castel in Italy, or the Schloss in Germany, you will see what magnificence. Or the priest who says, I want surplus not just so I can have a robe, so I can have food. I want the surplus to sustain an army of workers building a cathedral, building a spectacular mosque that we. And why is that useful to a society? Because it will impress all the workers. Look at that mosque. Allah has blessed us. Allah celebrates us, and we celebrate Allah. It's the way communities develop. They decide each in their own way. And one of Marx's points was to say, it doesn't matter whether people are conscious of what they are doing or not. Every society produces a surplus. Therefore, every society has to decide how to distribute the surplus. And it does that. But it's not aware of itself doing that. That brings me to something I wanted to say right after your introduction, Shahram. If you had, I worked with Althusser for a while in person. And when I worked with Althusser, one of the things he stressed to me personally in my meetings and workings with him was the origin of his idea about overdetermination. Shahram, at the beginning, you explained it very clearly and very well. The only thing I would add is what Althusser told me, because you took it back to Althusser. Althusser was very, very modest. And he kept saying to me, I took that idea from Sigmund Freud. I took it from Freud's book of 1895, The Interpretation of Dreams. I like to stress it because of the parallel right here. Freud's work teaches us that we have not one brain, but at least two, or at least two levels of our brain. One which we call the conscious, and one which we call the subconscious or the unconscious or something else. And in our lives, starting when we're born, some of our experiences are registered in our consciousness. So I can bring them back. You can say, what was it like when you were 4 years old? And I can make an effort and try to tell you. But there are experiences we have that go into the other part of our brain, the unconscious. And when you ask me about them, I don't know what you're talking about. They are unconscious. I'm not aware of them. Now, Freud then developed techniques to enable him, as your doctor, to interact with you, the conversation, the therapeutic conversation that allows you and him or her together to figure out elements, never all of it, but elements of your unconscious. And it turns out it's therapeutic. If you understand a traumatic event that you experienced when you were 2, it can help you now. It can help you now not react badly to this moment, not to see in this person something you're afraid of, but it isn't actually in that person. All the things we do as human beings, we will understand better. We will be therapeutically assisted in our life if we have some interaction with our unconscious. Well, why is this important? Because Marx is teaching us about part of our social unconsciousness. We're not aware that we produce and distribute surplus. There are all kinds of reasons why we're not aware. Freud is very brilliant on saying, why are we not aware of this traumatic event? Well, because We were babies. And our mother at that moment was irritated. And we could tell that her body tightened up. She was a little bit hostile to us. We were aware of our total dependence on her for our daily food. We could not risk upsetting so powerful a person as the mother. And so we did something we're not even aware of, and we buried that experience. We don't want to remember it because it was frightening. Okay, if you take a child, an adult, through that, they will now no longer be so frightened because as an adult, it's not so scary. And by going through it again as an adult, you don't need to have the affective traumatization. You can undo at least some of that traumatization. And Marx's argument is the same. We can do better socially now in the 21st century if we understand that all societies like ours have opportunities, alternatives in how we organize the production and distribution of the surplus. We don't have to live in a society where a tiny group of people dictate how much surplus is produced, who does it, and then they decide what to do with it. This is, to be blunt, autocratic, dictatorial. There's not democracy at all, but it doesn't have to be. If we understand, we can. We, the producers, can decide how much surplus, how to do it, where to do it, and what to do with the surplus. That's all available to us. There's nothing necessary, nothing absolute about the way we're doing it now. And in the recognition of that, there is a fantastic economic, dare I say it, freedom. To all of you who are interested in freedom, who have grown up in a society that fetishizes freedom, Marxism opens up the freedom of reorganizing the enterprise where you spend most of your adult life. And we should be grateful to Marxism for the freedom it enables.
I want to go back to this distinction that you drew because it's so provocative as well as controversial in Marxian economics. This distinction between productive and unproductive labor, because you mentioned it, and I want to dive into it slightly more because it generates all kinds of interesting discussions and debates and arguments from both sides. Um, because you're a proponent of, or rather, you've developed the idea of overdetermination. Um, and I'm thinking of this thing that Marx wrote in the theories of surplus value on this particular subject, productive and unproductive labor, where he gives us the example of a clown who could be working in different kinds of conditions. And depending on the precise conditions of existence of that particular producing arrangement, we're going to arrive at a different notion of what the clown is doing. So I want to return to this issue of productive and unproductive labor and ask you the following question. Can we deduce simply by looking at the act of a particular labor, say a violinist is playing the violin or a clown is doing the work that they do, or whatever work is being performed, can we just look at the physical act itself and deduce something about the productive or unproductive nature, or do we need more conditions of existence? Is it overdetermined, in other words, by the precise arrangement that we're looking at?
Let me begin by acknowledging with you that there are disagreements and differences about this. And I don't want to pretend that that isn't the case. But I also want to be clear what my position, what Steve Resnick's position is. And that is an unambiguous answer. It is only the conditions that will, it is never deducible whether you are a productive or an unproductive laborer by what you do, whether you play the violin or turn a screw on a machine or whatever else it is. It is only the social totality which will determine whether your labor is productive or not. And again, the determinant is a analysis. Do you produce a surplus, or do you enable others to produce a surplus? And it is possible, of course, that you do both, and that has to be acknowledged. So let me give you an example. Uh, Other traditions of this notion uh, have made what I would consider a theoretical mistake, but not for them. In their system, it makes sense. But in my system, it would be a mistake to say that a person in a household who does labor, cooking, cleaning, childcare, things that are widely, allocated to females, is somehow unproductive. Nothing could be further from in my view, from the truth. That associates unproductivity with the particular task, how you use your brains and your muscles. I don't like that at all. I think it's easy for me to show you that cooking and cleaning and so forth in a household is in fact productive labor that does in fact produce a surplus that is appropriated by somebody and distributed by that somebody in particular ways toward particular ends. In other words, the household is a site of productive labor. Let me give you another example. In some theoretical frameworks, it's terribly important when the woman who does this household work leaves the household, let's say because she must to sustain the family's income, or she gets divorced, or whatever it is, and now she goes out and gets a job in a capitalist cleaning, cooking service that sells cleaning and cooking to people who can afford to buy it. And she becomes a laborer working for the capitalist who sells this commodity, cleaning, the service commodity of cleaning. She's then a proletarian. She's producing surplus that'll take the form of the profit of the capitalist employer who sells the cleaning surplus. She's doing the same work. She's bending over with a rag and a vacuum cleaner and whatever else she needs, working with the tools of her profession. But she's a productive laborer. Whether it's productive or not is not a function of what she's doing. It's a function of the relationships within which she's doing it. By the way, a footnote for people. Marxian economics is all about human relationships. That's what the economics is trying to understand. What are the relationships we are brought into with one another for economic reasons? That is, we have a relationship built around the production and distribution of the surplus. We have also relationships built around sex, and we have relationships built around childcare, and we have relationships built around citizenship in a community. So the economics is just part of but it is all about the relationships that economics entails.
Wow. Wow, that's a really, really lovely way of putting it, to be honest. Just for the audiences, Professor Wolff briefly alluded to the idea that whatever we're discussing, this idea of the surplus, can and has been applied to other sites, including the household. For those of you who are interested, Fraud, Resnick, and Wolff wrote this paper called For Every Knight in Shining Armor, There is a Castle Waiting to be Cleaned. Rick, I wanted to because we want to understand the way you've developed this theory and used words so that we can intelligently talk about it ultimately. So it's the surplus. Okay, I get that. A surplus is produced. Okay, I understand that. It's appropriated. I get that. And then it's distributed. So now we want to talk about this in an intelligent way and develop it into a theory. So you and Steve came up with a language to talk about this. So this is the surplus. It's divided into three parts: production, appropriation, and distribution. You called the first two of these, i.e., production and appropriation, by a name called the fundamental class process, and the remaining part is the distribution part, is the subsumed part. So, can you help us understand a how you came up with this language, and b uh, because now we're kind of entering into this zone which is very different from orthodox Marxism, which had this periodic kind of understanding of things. And we're moving now into a world where all of these interesting class processes can coexist at the same time. So I wanted to kind of go in that direction now. Could you help us understand that?
Sure. Partly this was just a way for Steve and I, when we did this work, to keep it manageable in our heads. We were at that time rereading Marx's Capital really carefully. In my case, for the second or third time, and Steve's second time, maybe the third too. I'm not sure. And as happens with all great books, not just Marx, when you go back a second and a third time, you amaze yourself by that which you didn't see the first time, that you see now, or that you see differently. It's a wonderful demonstration of that remark that attributed to Hegel, that you can never step in the same river twice, because between the last time and this time, both you and the river have changed. And so there is no, when scientists say we replicated the experiment, you grin, because that's not available. Nobody does that. You didn't do it. No one else ever did it. And you have to remember that, or else you make terrible, terrible inferences about what you do. So we were grasping at something which is partly bibliographical. It's worth it for a moment to explain that. Marx wrote volume 1 of Capital. He didn't write volumes 2 and 3. Volumes 2 and 3 were written by Engels and by Kautsky later, after Marx had died in 1883. And it shows. Marx was not just a great thinker, but he was a great writer. He had a sense of humor. He had read very widely. If you look at volume 1 with its quotations from Dante and Shakespeare and on, it is a written tour de force, as the Communist Manifesto was as well. And Engels was the first to recognize all of that. But when he was dead, he couldn't do for volumes 2 and 3 what was later done. Those were notebooks. And in fact, they were notebooks, some of which were originally planned to be in volume 1. They were then later changed. Marx wrote many drafts of volume 1 before he settled on that which was published. Why am I telling you all of this? Because there is a discontinuity. We tried to understand both what is different in volumes 2 and 3 from what there is in volume 1, and yet what is also part of the same project. That's not easy to do. And for those of you not clear on it, you will discover, if you read all of them, which I urge you to do, they are wonderful sources of understanding. But you will also struggle with how to keep that in your head. We found it helpful to use this word fundamental for what we learned out of volume 1, and subsumed for what we learned out of volume 2, because they're held together by their relationship to the production distribution of surplus. So we can say production distribution of surplus is the totality, and production, that's the volume 1 story, in large part. And volumes 2 and 3 is the other story of the distribution. That's all. It was meant as an organization. We later on, more than once, regretted having given them that name, because the word fundamental carries an association that somehow it's more important or more basic, none of which is the case. It is, all we meant is it's fundamental to the understanding of the totality. That's all. It's not more fundamental in any other way that I can think of. Okay? Having said that, we wanted people to understand the universality of the production of the surplus. In other words, it's a reasonable place to begin a study of capitalism because it's a reasonable place to begin the study of any economic system. It's a way of understanding, in fact, how one system differs from another. And here we are, like any other scientist, we understand the difference between a living plant and a living animal. But we have a word to help us begin to understand that plant and animal are different. They are both living, but they are different. So fundamental and subsumed is about the surplus, but they are different. One of them focuses on this story of the surplus and the other one on that. Animal functions on this way life occurs, and plant uh, does it. Botany is not zoology. We develop it, but it doesn't say that zoology is more important, although there are people who have, of course, wanted to go in that direction. But we rejected that, and we were sorry that our language contributed to that. What the term fundamental, therefore, meant to us was that's where we begin. We ask the question about any community that we might look at. Does there exist in this community the production of a surplus? Are there people systematically producing more than they themselves consume, such that there is a surplus whose distribution we can then inquire about? So, for example, a mother taking her child on a walk in the woods comes upon a piece of wood, and the child turns to the mother and says, "Make me a little dolly." And so the mother takes a knife and carves the figure of a little girl, which she gives to her little girl. Is labor being done? Yes. Is she using the mother, her brains and her muscles? Yes. Is she transforming nature? Yes. Is this work? Yes. Is there a surplus? No. No. We make the decision. Why? There's no ongoing reproduction of. She is doing something, producing a product. It is not going into any exchange, no market. It's not a commodity, therefore, because it doesn't go through an exchange. It is an act of love, or whatever you want to call it, and she gives it to her child. So we have determined, by looking at this situation, that we are not going to use the analytical apparatus of the theory of the surplus in this situation, right? When that woman ends their day and wakes up the next morning and goes to work in a factory nearby, we would ask the same question. What is she doing in the factory? Is she laboring? Yes. Is she using her brains and muscles? Absolutely. Is she producing a surplus? Yes. Because there we find it. Now, we don't do the analysis because we find it. We find it because we do the analysis, right? You don't find the answer unless you have the question. Other people look at this, they don't have the questions we do because they have a different analytical apparatus, which is fine. I mean, I understand that people think differently. The Marxian question begins with this, and that's the only sense in which it's fundamental. The minute we answer the fundamental question, yes, there is a surplus here. And by the way, Marxists within our theoretical framework can disagree about this. We're not all going to see it the same way. be an interesting debate. I have had that debate with other people who work in the same theoretical framework I do, who look at a situation, and I learn. Sometimes I realize I was wrong. This is a surplus. I see why they are saying it.
Yeah.
I didn't at first. But once that is asked, then if there is a surplus, then I'm going to be very interested in understanding who the appropriator is. That's my next question. If there's a surplus, who gets it? Does the person who produced it get it? That happens sometimes. Does the person who produced it not get it? That happens too. By the way, one of the greatest teaching mechanisms I've discovered over the years is when I say something which in this theoretical framework is obvious, but comes to my student audiences as a bolt. I say, think about this. Because I talk to students, many of whom have had jobs, so they know what it's like to work somewhere in an office or a factory or a store or a farm. I say, you go to work, you arrive at 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the morning, you stay 8 hours, you work, you use your brains, you use your muscle, you sit where you're told, you work with these machines on this raw material, and you do this, and you write a memo, or you produce an op, and then there's a moment at 5 o'clock when something absolutely magical happens. You stand up, you leave the premises, you walk away, you leave behind everything you did. In the instant that you produced it, it became somebody else's property. If you take any of it home with you, they will come and arrest you and hurt you. You will be a thief who stole the property you produced from you, and no one said a word. You've accepted this thievery, this magical, instantaneous deprivation of what you have just poured your creativity into. That's a remarkable thing to do to people. It is a kind of trauma. Yes, you're an adult, but deep down, you know what it feels like? It feels like being a 2-year-old in a sandbox playing with your truck, and another child comes over to you, throws sand in your face, and takes your truck. You feel what? Deprived, assaulted, denied, hurt. Yeah, you're an adult, so you don't show it. But for all we know, and here comes Marx, you are traumatized every day again at 5 o'clock when it's driven home to you that you are nothing. You're just a means for this thing you've left behind to have become real. And we will now take it from you, and we will decide what to do with it, all of that. You'll never see it again. You'll have no relationship to it again.
Wow.
It is a small version of losing your own child. I try to get them to understand the trauma here, which isn't the less because you can't articulate it. If you do psychology, you will discover, and this is what Freud discovered, that we all, as infants, unless you're very unusual, have a variety of sexually connected traumas, right? I won't go into them because even to this day, people get weird when you start talking about, you can't talk about sex, you can't talk about infantile sexuality. But that's what Freud discovered, and nobody has undone, you can't unsee what you were once able to see. So he tells us, this has enormous effect, and that the world is filled with people who are living out the trauma of an infantile sexuality which could never be spoken, which sits in the memory. It's not in the unconscious. At least some of it is in the, you do remember what Uncle did on that afternoon. You really do. But you have never spoken to anyone about it. The psychologists tell us trauma is bad. Trauma you cannot discuss, much worse. It then sits there. It works its horror. It makes it ever more difficult to remember because it's become so horrible. You can't. And the whole point then of Marxism, if you put on your psychological glass, is to do for society what therapy in a Freudian sense does for the individual. Make you aware of A, that there is material you're not looking at, and B, give you some clues as to why you're not looking at it. So it becomes less traumatic, less overwhelming. You have a bit of an understanding of what happened to you. You can develop compassion for yourself rather than thinking you have to hide from this scary reality that somehow lurks around you. And then you can see what happens if that gets too far. Then we get things like paranoia, or we get like pathologies of various kinds. Althusser's Marxism is heavily Freud. We don't call it Freudian for a whole host of interesting reasons, because it went through Althusser. But the influence of Freud is very profound. And in my judgment, it helps us do a kind of Marxism we couldn't have done before. Marx didn't do that work for whatever reason. I don't want to take away from Marx, but he didn't. Freud did. Freud didn't understand Marxism. He knew a little bit about it, but he didn't understand it. He didn't even get close to those in Vienna at his time who were. One of the greatest phases of Marxism's development occurs in the 1890s and the first decades of the 20th century in Vienna, where Freud practices. And the circle of intellectuals who did this was very small, and they all knew of or about each other. Freud knew Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein knew Carnap, and Carnap knew Max Adler and Rudolf Hilferding and other major Marxists. So it was there, it just didn't get together to gel. It took Althusser later in another context to go back and do with the Freud what the contemporary Marxists of Freud who met him and knew him couldn't do.
This is a fascinating trajectory to think about. And I just want to kind of, because haven't really encountered, as an economist, we don't really encounter Marx, let alone encountering Freud, which I was very grateful for because I took these classes with you and Steve. I really want to kind of push you a little further on this issue of the links between class exploitation and repression, Freudian repression. Because as soon as you say it out loud, the connection becomes immediately obvious on multiple fronts. Okay, so exploitation, sexual repression, etc., takes place in a hidden place no one finds out about. Class exploitation takes place in the hidden abode of production, and the market, which is the observed world, I mean, equal stuff and blah blah blah, all the rest of it. So once we begin to see these parallels between Freudian psychology and Marxism, as Althusser did, and is there anyone else in the Marxian economics tradition who found the Freudian kind of way of thinking about the project interesting? Because, I mean, in my understanding, the traditional or orthodox Marxists were generally speaking dismissive of this idea. Is that not? And why is it that Althusserians, for example, who understood this, have picked on this particular issue and tried to combine Marx and Freud into telling a story. And so, in Knowledge in Class, for example, one of the things that I found really fascinating is that because of this approach that you guys took, where you decided that we're not going to reduce it to one or the other process, that also allows us to think about all of those other relationships in society that are not a result of the employer employee relationship, but are nevertheless beneficiaries of the class exploitation of workers, such as the state, for example, or let's use the word subsumed classes.
Good.
Now, I wanted to just, because we're running out of time and we've talked a lot about the fundamental class process, I really wanted to understand the subsumed class process, because many a times Steve used to say that it's entirely possible that we want to explain a crisis of capitalism, and we really have to seek it not in the fundamental class process but in the subsumed class process, such that the distributions are more than the production. And you've already kind of been very kind of kind to say that it's not about one is more important than the other. So, because we have just about 10 minutes left and we've talked a lot about the fundamental class process, could you help us understand for different societies how the subsumed class process matters for our analysis and our understanding of the political project as well as the economic project?
Sure. Probably the easiest way is to give a few examples. Take a modern corporation. It has productive workers. That is, it has an army of employees who will make something of telephones. They make cell phones in a factory and so forth. Okay. In order for them to do their productive labor, something interesting has to be done that isn't production at all. The production of the telephone means you use a certain set of machines on a certain set of raw materials, wire, plastics, computer boards, all kinds of things, and you put them together to make a telephone. Okay, in order for you to do your work, there has to be a ready quantity of a certain quality of inputs, whatever they are. Somebody has to do that. That person is not making a telephone. That on the factory, on the assembly line. That person is in another place negotiating with somebody who produces plastic about a certain kind of plastic, of a certain quality, of a certain shape that has to be delivered in this period of time to this location. Who's doing all of that? In a corporation, that's called the purchasing department. These are people who, to use the language, enable the productive laborer to be productive. Without them, the productive laborer would wonder, where's the next piece of plastic? I can't make the telephone. I have everything else. I have the skill. I I don't have the plastic. That plastic is, when they say we have an interruption in the supply chain, that's what they mean. Something of the many components is missing, is not available, hasn't the right quality, hasn't the right quantity, hasn't the right price if it's purchased in the market, etc., etc. So there's an army of people in the purchasing department. Those are unproductive laborers. Their salaries and the budgets they get with which to purchase are distributions of the surplus in order to get that important thing done. Because if you don't do that properly, the whole enterprise is at risk. It's as much at risk as if the workers who make the telephone go to the bathroom and sit on the toilet all day, or if they have a strike and refuse to work. You're dead. You don't produce telephones. But without that plastic, you don't produce telephones. So there's no debate here about who's more or less important, but it's a radically different relationship to the whole enterprise that these two people have. It's a little bit like saying you need arms and legs. Which is more important? Kind of stupid conversation. Your arms are there in an important way, and your legs are there, and you're going to be a very different person without either of them. And either way, you're going to be so different, you're not going to be yourself. You're going to be something else, a one-armed version or a one-legged version. And that's the same thing here. Or if it's both legs, you stop being mobile. The same thing with a factory, comparable. So it's here's another example. Lawyer, you're a lawyer. You're hired in the company because a certain number of your products out of your factory or your office, it doesn't matter, may well be defective. And when they go out there and get sold, somebody is going to hurt themselves because they're using your product and they cut themselves and they bleed and it gets infected. They sue you. They sue you to compensate them for their loss through the use of your product. You need to protect yourself. You have to. Otherwise, you will be fined, and that will remove your surplus to pay the fine, and you won't be able to reproduce yourself. So you must have a lawyer. And so you have this happen often enough, you hire a lawyer, you put him in an office. Does that person help make these telephones that you're a producer of? No, never touches a machine, doesn't know what a technology is about. He sits in an office. He enables your productive workers to continue to be productive because he will file a lawsuit, defend you, file against someone suing you. He will enable your business to function despite a lawsuit if one happens to you. Here's another example. Suppose your workers get infected by Marxism and they decide one day that they're not going to work for you anymore. They want you to go home. They're taking over the enterprise. Okay? You don't like this. It's your enterprise. So you have the following opportunity. You pick up the telephone, you call the police, and the police send over a bus. In the bus are 30 armed men who jump out and terrorize your workers to go back to work. Uh, this is very comforting. You want to be able, you want there to be 20 men in blue uniforms with sticks and guns waiting all day, every day for whenever the phone call comes. And so you're willing to pay a tax, take a portion of your surplus, deliver it to a place called the government so that you have the enablement to deal with a strike by your workers in the event it becomes scary in the way I've just described. These are enablers. The those workers in the blue uniform, they have to get paid. They have to eat, they have to sleep, they have to dress themselves, they have to be paid a salary. They are working, they're trained to do their work, blah, 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 blah. And it's all sustained by a distribution of the surplus. Whenever you have, and this for those of you that are interested in politics, if you have an economic system in which a tiny group of people are dominant over a large group. In other words, you have what Marx would call an exploitative fundamental class process. Well, then you're going to find 99% of the time the need for a portion of the surplus to be handled to keep those repressed masses down, because periodically it is likely to blow. That's been our experience with slave revolts, serf revolts, workers' strikes, workers' revolutions, blah, blah, blah. Look, is it possible you wouldn't need it? Yes. If you have a strong enough ideological, and Althusser is brilliant about this. He wrote an article called Ideological State Apparatuses, where he says ideology can work like the government. Ideology, something you learn to believe in your school, in your church, in your whatever, could be strong enough that you don't need armed police, because workers, whatever happens to them, however exploited, will come up with other explanations and other responses They will not threaten the fundamental class problem, in which case you've saved money. You give a little bit extra to the ideological apparatus, the church, or whatever, and and Marx plays with this as we can, and you can see how different societies solve the problem of enabling the fundamental class process to be reproduced over time, as it must to keep a society going. Well, then you must have one or another kind of enablement. And to go to your point, you will have a crisis if you don't enable it properly. And therein lies one of the great conundrums of capitalism. You can't know that in advance. The capitalist who gets the surplus from you, the worker, makes a decision. He has to, because it's his job. How much am I going to pay for lawyers? Am I going to have one lawyer or two? Will I need three? If I don't have the lawyers on staff, what will I do? Well, I will have a richer purchasing department. That's good. But if you don't have a problem with purchasing, you're going to have people sitting there who aren't doing anything because you don't need them, but you needed the lawyer. You allocated your surplus in the wrong way, Jack, and you're going down. You're losing your business. That's why capitalists have heart attacks early. They are in an impossible situation because they have to know in advance what the best way is to distribute the surplus so as to reproduce the fundamental. And there is no way to know in advance. It's always a guess. And how you can explain, which Marxists can do, how do you explain that you all know the name Ford and General Motors, but you don't know the name Studebaker? Why not? Because they didn't distribute their surplus, those idiots, and so they're gone. Or the Packard Corporation, or the Mercury Corporation. We once had 30 car companies in the United States. You don't know the names but of two or three of them. Ford, GM, and Chrysler. All the rest are unknown, right? Unknown, except for old people who remember. But the way you explain why one business succeeds and another is that within Marxian theory, you don't have to ask about the technology because they all differently distribute the surplus, which includes changing the technology that's being produced. Every firm is in that way different. And this difference is not extrinsic to the model, to the way of thinking. It's intrinsic. It's one of the questions the theory requires you to ask.
It's one of the questions that the theory requires you to ask. All right, guys, I hope you got something out of it. Next week, the Dialectic is going to return with the Fundamental and Subsumed Class Framework, and we're going to ask Professor Wolff how fundamental class revenues, subsumed class revenues, terms we're going to learn about in the next episode, impact the trajectory of a firm and the macroeconomy as a whole. All right, guys, here's Shahram Azhar signing off. I'll see you all next week. Take care.
Bye-bye.